Sabali Valley means go for a walk. Tala means too much talk. Alafayati boy means I love you. Take it easy, fine, fine, do you know? Tinamani means pretty girl.
That popular Samoan children's song serves as an apt beginning for this video essay examining culturally responsive pedagogy. There's been a lot of talk in education about the need to adopt culturally responsive practice, but overall there hasn't been a lot of effective action, not a lot of walk to back up the talk. The theme of this paper is "Let me walk in my shoes." We'll explore what we mean by culture and just why culturally responsive teaching is necessary in education. We'll examine potential barriers to this happening, compare a number of frameworks for thinking about culturally responsive practice, and how I can apply it in my own practice. But what are we talking about here? The term culturally responsive pedagogy refers to education which consciously respects the cultural individuality of students in all aspects of learning. According to Mary Berryman, culturally responsive pedagogy is practice where interactions emerge from relationships where culture counts, where learners and teachers share power, have a common purpose and vision, and reciprocal responsibility. But why might we need such an approach? Well, New Zealand ranks third amongst OECD countries for the highest proportion of overseas-born residents, and Auckland City now has one of the highest proportions of immigrants of any city in the OECD. The Euro report on diverse language use in Auckland notes that people everywhere learn differently, process information in different ways, and look to different external cues for understanding the world. This will require a new kind of literacy, on a par with the importance of reading and writing skills or numeracy. Cultural literacy has become the lifeline for today's world, a fundamental resource for harnessing the multiple venues education can take, and an indispensable tool for transcending the clash of ignorances. It can be seen as part of a broad toolkit of worldviews, attitudes, and competences that young people acquire for their lifelong journey. But let's start with the basics. Culture is a pretty big term, which can make it difficult to attend to thinking about what we may mean by culturally responsive programs in education, health, or employment. This video explores what we mean by culture and just why culturally responsive teaching is necessary in our education systems. It examines potential barriers to this happening, then compares a number of frameworks for thinking about culturally responsive teaching and how I could apply it to my own practice. As a social sciences teacher, I commonly use the analogy of the cultural iceberg, which illustrates the idea that what we see at the surface is only a small part of the whole, that beneath the surface there is much more, and that may not be easy to access or to understand. At the surface of the iceberg are the most obviously visible and easily understood aspects of culture: food, music, clothing, sports, and while we may interact with these across cultures, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Lying below these surface features are shallow aspects, which are a little more complex: arts, body language, politics, customs, that we can see and can understand if we try. I'll come back to these shallow features later. Deep features, however, take time to see and understand, and they form the largest part of the cultural iceberg. They're slower to change, as they're formed through generations of history, family, and community heritage, and encompass spiritual beliefs, attitudes, and values. Just as water makes the iceberg, so does language create culture. Language is woven throughout all the features and all layers of the cultural iceberg, and it captures the essence of a group's ways of thinking, their worldview, their very being. In this respect, language is culture, and culture is language. While cultural changes may occur at the tips of the icebergs, it's a much slower process for change to occur in the deeper parts, where values, knowledge, ways of thinking, beliefs are found and are bound by tradition and older forms of thinking. Of course, when one culture interacts with another, there may well be a suppression of culture if one group establishes dominance. This can lead to the dominant group enacting policies to separate, segregate, or even eliminate those who are different. A more subtle form of oppression is assimilation, whereby the minority culture is forced to adopt the ways of the dominant culture, to fall into line with their cultural worldview, so to speak. Quite apart from the enforced displacement from their own lands and economic potential, in colonized countries, indigenous people have been prevented from learning or speaking their own language while at school. This is tragic, as losing language means losing culture, losing identity, and ultimately a loss of freedom as educational failure and economic inequity leads to an increase in criminal behaviours amongst the displaced and dispossessed group or groups. In New Zealand, despite various attempts to redress historic assimilation policies and underachievement by Māori, or to lower the rates of incarceration, the imbalances persist. This situation is similar in other countries with colonial histories, such as Canada and Australia. In an equitable society, minority groups would be imprisoned at the same relative rate as the majority culture. But in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that is not the case. When we also compare levels of educational attainment, the effects of a culturally biased education system are clear. In Canada, 67% of first people gain formal qualifications compared to 79% for the total population. In Australia, 62% of first peoples and Torres Strait Islanders gain qualifications compared to 86% for the total population. And in New Zealand, the figures are 48% for Māori compared to 65% for the total population. Although the dominant culture may eventually seek to address these depressing inequities, this is usually in terms of providing remedial support rather than any radical reformation of critical institutions. This is a deficit model of support, suggesting there is something wrong with the ability of minorities to function in the mainstream systems of learning and assessment, that it is the minority who need fixing rather than the system itself. Moreover, unconscious bias for teachers from the dominant culture perpetuates the idea that it is not the system that is at fault. So how have those three countries responded to their inequities? Well, Australia began their Closing the Gap policy in 2008, and in the same year, Canada proposed a similar policy, which is yet to be implemented nationally. In New Zealand, the 1987 recognising te reo as an official language and the 1989 Education Act have helped to restore and revitalise a kaupapa Māori praxis, which moves Māori away from waiting for things to be done to them to doing things for themselves, a move away from positioning Māori as the problem to recognising Māori potential. Over the last 30 years, this praxis has resulted in groundbreaking initiatives, developing Māori language-based and culturally located educational institutions at all levels, Kohanga Reo, Kura Kaupapa Māori, Wharekura, and Wānanga. These Māori medium schools teach in Māori and education is based on Māori culture and values. Māori students are enjoying education success and are not having to compromise their cultural identity to do so. However, by far the majority of Māori students, 90% in 2015, are in English medium mainstream schools. Currently in these schools, success for many students continues to be through assimilation into the English medium agenda. Something else is needed to provide a similarly rewarding experience for these students as for those in Māori medium learning. Hence the across all levels of education, which means recognising the diverse cultural characteristics of learners as assets. Culturally responsive teaching empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Ka Hikatea, Managing Success, is just that, a culturally responsive strategy, introduced by the Ministry of Education in 2008 as a means to step up, lift up, and lengthen the stride towards Māori achievement. The Ministry recognised the need for an extensive change in positioning, expectations, and practices across the entire education sector. It was about a shift in thinking and behaviour, a change in attitudes and expectations. But it's not a straightforward matter to embed. Teachers may hold on to their unconscious bias, and the challenge of shifting thinking requires school leaders to understand how to best influence staff to develop culturally responsive practices. By Nicholas Williams, a principal noted that leaders needed to be cautious of giving the right level of support and challenge to staff. Too much pushing might cause a person to withdraw, but not enough might mean people didn't move out of their comfort zones. Another principal used the analogy of a nourishing baby. You don't feed the baby with meat. They can't digest it. They have got to have milk. How then might we move the process along for all learners in New Zealand, across the increasingly culturally diverse cohorts of students appearing in our classrooms? Are there frameworks of thinking about culturally responsive practice which might be readily adopted by teachers who are also being challenged to personalise their approaches to learning and fulfil the demands for 21st century skills? Well, there are plenty of models and lists which provide guidance without specifically mentioning culture. Let's start with the key competencies needed for effective learning in New Zealand. A culturally responsive pedagogy supports these competencies, but also promotes deeper consideration of collective behaviours that help to create culture. In New Zealand, of course, an appreciation of Māori values for learning is most important, and this model certainly incorporates those. Are there other models we might assess for creating culturally responsive practice? Can we find commonalities across the research into learning and into best practice? How about Professor Guy Claxton's Building Learning Power model, holistically developing these 4 critical learning muscles? The Maine Centre for Open Learning recently revised their model for meaningful engaged learning to include these 6 principles. Perhaps the models based on heutagogy, designs to personalise and support lifelong self-determined learning, could also support culturally responsive teaching. Or teachers might go with this, one of my favourites, the 4 mechanisms for best practice in social studies, easily applicable to any learning area. Other teachers might like the framework of 5 fluencies for creating global digital citizens. A comparative study of just those 5 models of competencies and principles quickly reveals plenty of common ideas, especially the importance of relationships, collaboration, cooperation, and authentic student-directed and solution-focused thinking for learning. Getting those concepts into a coherent and user-friendly framework is essential if we hope teachers can indeed embrace a culturally responsive pedagogy. So let's look at a couple of specific frameworks designed for that. Walkowski and Ginsberg's framework for culturally responsive teaching is based on theories of intrinsic motivation. No single teaching strategy consistently engages all learners. Motivation is inseparable from culture, and what elicits frustration, joy, or determination may differ across cultures because cultures vary in defining novelty, hazard, opportunity, and gratification. And is capable of creating a common culture of learning and curiosity that all students can accept. Within this framework, pedagogical alignment is critical. The more harmonious the elements of teaching are, the more likely they are to evoke, encourage, and sustain intrinsic motivation. Tina Mai, a whole school strength-based behavioural intervention for Māori. Their framework is expressed in a model of educultural values. The frameworks we've looked at, we can see the same key ideas of relationships, of perseverance, of leadership for thinking, of empathy, care, and collaboration, framed in cultural values and concepts of Māori tikanga. Regardless of the framework, we need to ask how culturally responsive teaching might meet the needs of marginalised students, transform their outcomes, and create equity. The State of Oregon's National Equity Project defines equity as reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails, interrupting reproductive practices that negatively impact vulnerable and marginalised students, and cultivating the unique gifts and talents of every student. Hammond's Dimensions of Equity model shows multicultural education as a beginning point and can kickstart responsive teaching. Social justice programs are also supportive, but fully responsive practice is centered around the affective and cognitive aspects of learning and teaching. This is perhaps a good moment to come back to the layers of culture, as we saw in the iceberg model. Rather than the cultural iceberg, Zaretta Hammond uses the analogy of a tree to explain the layers of culture. And she says that culturally responsive pedagogy should aim to get down into the shallow levels of culture because interactions here elicit emotional responses. Hammond's model of Ready for Rigor is a further complementary example of a simple, culturally responsive framework. It is based on nurturing strong relationships of trust, care, and sincere interest in and commitment to the success of all learners. So how do I practice being culturally responsive? I'm fortunate that my own children are, variously, of Māori, Samoan, and Tokelauan descent, and this helps frame my worldview and helps me to walk comfortably alongside many of my students on their learning journeys. But there's more I can do. In a research paper by Delia Baskerville, a drama teacher, she describes being fully immersed in te reo and in marae life for 3 months with a drama group. And through her experiences, she deepened her understanding of tikanga and learned to understand how the cultural scripts of Māori students are shaped by values, beliefs, attitudes, needs, and customs that are the essence of Māori culture itself. Her raised consciousness of possibility and ability to imagine improved conditions created a culturally responsive praxis in her teaching following her experience with the group. The ways in which tikanga can be incorporated in learning are powerful, as they're practices which honour the people, the place, and the purpose of a classroom situation. Beginning a class with a karakia does not necessarily require a prayer or a song, but could be a relevant quote from any source, which serves to honour the moment. Similarly, closing off a body of study by way of a poroporoaki, a farewell, bookends the karakia ritual by way of reflecting on the journey travelled and the journey ahead until the group gathers again. Consciously building relationships with individuals and of communities or teams of students is already something I endeavour to place at the front of my practice. I begin every year by asking students to examine their cultural identity, and through their shared artefacts we build our understandings of each other as people. The information shared provides powerful reference points, not just to our studies, but to the ongoing development of our relationships with each other. I've always looked to use frameworks for success from the culture of sports, and will continue to use these as a basis for translating fundamental ideas into other languages. In recent years, I've started investigating how to leverage the power of social media to create shared spaces for students and teachers and parents, which break down the barrier of the classroom walls. Beyond that circle of influence is the wider school and the communities of our suburban and economic neighbours. Engaging with people in this way is critical for building a sense of collectivism. The Aero report on responding to language diversity in Auckland describes the economic and social benefits of diversity, from economic innovation associated with immigrant entrepreneurialism to exposure of local people to new values, practices, institutions, foods, languages, and worldviews. Diversity is seen as comparative advantage and opportunity. To reap this diversity dividend, we must prepare teachers, early learning services, schools and learners to adapt, respond, and mutually benefit. A principal noted, learners do not have to be ready to come to us, we have to be ready for them. And if teachers are able to be ready, to be culturally responsive, to allow students to walk along the learning journey in their own shoes, then we will collectively build pathways towards equity.